I'm Ninamary Langsdale. I am a distinguished daughter of the University of Pittsburgh. I hold a degree in economics and a degree in English that I got in 1974. And I got my MBA here in 1993. Thank you. All right. Is this better? Okay. All right. I am Ninamary Langsdale, and I am a distinguished daughter of the University of Pittsburgh. I have a degree in economics and one in English, both of which I got in 1974. And I got my MBA through the Executive MBA program here in 1993. Yay. Thank you, Jerry Zoffer, for coming. It is wonderful to see you. It is my joy to thank all of the people who have, particularly our sponsors. I am involved in this effort through the Thomas Merton Center, New Economy Working Group, and we, joining us, are sponsors, the University of Pittsburgh School of Social Work, the Department of Sociology, and the two departments within CMU, the Students for Deliberative Democracy and the Steinbrenner Institute for Environmental Education and Research. We have two outside organizations, the Pennsylvania Public Banking Project and Green Mountain Energy, and many, many individuals, some of whom I see in this audience, and I want to thank you all so very much for your support. Hosting us, though, is the David Berg Center for Ethics and Leadership of Pitt's Joseph M. Katz Graduate School of Business. The David Berg Center for Ethics and Leadership promotes the understanding and development of ethical business leadership and supports research in ethics, leadership, and corporate social responsibility. At the Berg Center, we accomplish our goals in three primary ways: by supporting the cutting-edge research of Katz faculty, developing meaningful experience-based learning opportunities for students, and being active in community engagement in the Pittsburgh area. We would like particularly to thank Heidi Bartholomew, who is the director of the Berg Center for Ethics and Leadership, professor of business administration at the Katz School. We'd like to also thank especially Doreen Hernandez, who is special events and communications manager. And so, why is the Thomas Merton Center involved in the new economy? We have our loosely formed mission is to identify and to support those who strive to enable both thriving economies and ecological health according to the principles of democracy, justice, and appropriate scale. Faced with complex ecological and environmental challenges, we believe that shared prosperity, sustainability, and an equitable society require deep systemic changes to both the economy and our politics, and that new collaborative techniques, energetic creativity, and an invigorated spirit of cooperation are required for successful transition to new ways of living. It is, I also want to acknowledge the members of the Thomas Merton New Economy Working Group who are in the audience. Thank you so very much for all of your hard work. If you'll please stand, could you stand? Oh. Thank you. Thank you so much. My co-moderator is Mark Dixon. And Mark is the producer of Your Environmental Road Trip and a graduate of Stanford, not the university.
Super. Yes, I can. So it's wonderful to have you all here. I'm so glad that you could make it. We want to get right to this. I'm going to give you a brief overview of what's going to happen. You're obviously here to explore all these issues. We're going to have Gar speaking about them for about 40 minutes or so, and then we're going to break into a panel discussion. Panelists will each give 3 minutes about the intersection of where Gar is coming from and the work that the panelist is doing specifically. And then we're going to open it up to questions from you and from our web audience. We are streaming live all around the country. And so we'll be taking questions on Twitter, but also live in the audience. And so I'll be running around and trying to find people or trying to connect with the people who want to ask the questions. So if you do have a question, please just stand up in the aisle, and I'll come and address you, and we'll have that conversation that way. So with that, I think we will. Do you want to? Yep. Okay. Oh, the Twitter address is NewgPGH, NEWGPGH is the Twitter address. Okay, so the new economy. Why do we need the new economy? Why is it relevant to all of us? The person who's going to give us the longest answer to that question today is Gar Alperovitz, the Lionel R. Bauman Professor of Political Economy at the University of Maryland. The author of several critically acclaimed books, his articles have appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, the New Republic, the Nation, the Atlantic, among other popular and academic publications. He's been a guest on numerous TV and cable news programs, including Meet the Press, Larry King Live, The Charlie Rose Show, Crossfire, and even The O'Reilly Factor. Yes, so he can take the heat. I think also it's very interesting and important to know that Gar has served as a legislative director in both houses of Congress and as a special assistant in the U.S. Department of State. So he brings that additional perspective as well. We're thrilled to have Gar Alperovitz. Please welcome him to Pittsburgh.
Thank you. So, am I on? Can you hear me in the back? Is it okay? Thanks for having me. Thanks for that generous introduction. Question: how many folks here are in the business school? From the business school? Small number. How many are students? Okay. How many involved in the Merton Center? Okay. How many are involved in the New Economy movement? Okay. Just wanted to get a sense. How many coming at it from the environmental movement? How many coming at it from poverty, economic development, et cetera? All right, got a sense of, just want to know who we are. I want to start this, the one thing I would add to the introduction, which is not I wear two hats. I really consider myself a historian as well as a political economist, and I've written in history. And I think one of the better ways to approach what we are doing is to think about this historically as well as what can be done and what is being done now around the country, and what can be done here and what is being done here and where it might go. So I want to kind of frame it in a different way. And the question is as follows. I'm going to give you a couple of comments, and you have to ask yourself, why is it occurring historically? So one of them is this. Last summer, in Orlando, Florida, of all places, you all know that's Mickey Mouse headquarters. That's where the Disneyland is, but they use it for conference centers. The Academy of Management, 19,000 business school professors from around the world, not the left, hardly, held their annual meeting, the subject of which was, is capitalism at an end? And if so, what is the implications for some future system beyond or not? And that was their question, not mine. That was similarly at Davos the year before, the founder of Davos publicly stated the same problem. Is capitalism at an end? If so, what does that mean? Is it not at an end, et cetera? So there's a new book just out in the United States. It's been out for a year in France by a man named Piketty. You're going to hear a lot about. It is being called the most important book on capitalism written since Karl Marx and Ricardo. Whether that's true or not, Piketty argues, very simple proposition actually, if you want to go through 900 pages, it's very statistical, that the best rates of growth of the economy, and we'll come back to whether growth is a good or bad thing, are roughly 3% per annum if you're doing well. We haven't been doing that well. Most businesses minimally, think about this, have to get 7 or 8% minimally, and many 10 or 12 or 15% return. Think about it. If those trends continue, 3% economy, but business taking 7 to 10%, there must be a shift over more and more to the business sector away from everybody else. That's the argument, and what his book is about is statistical, very deep statistical, very careful work, arguing that that's presenting a fundamental challenge to the whole system. We shall see where that goes, but my first suggestion to you is that as a historian, when these kinds of questions are in the air, not amongst fragments on the left, but in these kinds of realms, Piketty is a highly regarded economist around the world, something is happening that raises very profound issues even at that level that most people haven't noticed. It's at the level of the system itself and the question of, is there a systemic crisis, not simply a political problem? So I'm tossing that question out because we don't usually consider it that way, particularly in an audience of this kind. And if so, if we face a system problem, what does it tell us about where we might want to go and how we might get there? Now, I want to suggest to you that the new economy movement is actually beginning to pose that question, though it isn't quite put in those terms. And what the new economy movement is about, implicitly, I think, is a reaction to the same kinds of conditions that are producing these kinds of questions in different groups. So I'm going to give you just a few statistics. I don't like to spend a lot of time on numbers, but I want to give you a few because people aren't aware of some of the trend data that's behind this, and this is a way to kind of deepen the question. And here's the thing to look at. The difference between a political problem and a system problem of the kind that's reflected in those statements is that long trends, difficult trends, that don't change no matter who's in office, tell you that there's something deeper than a political problem. So I'm going to give you some trends. This is with Republicans and Democrats in office. Over the last half century, long trend, marginal tax rates for the top bracket have declined from 91% to 70% to 35% and are bouncing around in the 38% range. Huge decline over 50-year trend. Corporate tax rates gone from 32% of federal revenues in 1952 to 15% in 1972 to 10% in 2000 and are now in the range of 6%. Long decaying trends in favor of corporate. For the last 3 decades, the income of the top 1% has increased from about 10% to 20%. Last 3 decades, that's with Republicans and Democrats in office. Tells you something deeper is at work. For almost 40 years, the percentage of Americans in poverty has increased from a historic low of 11% in 1973, 15% roughly speaking now, and among African Americans, Hispanics, just about double that. Long trends going in the wrong direction. Not surprisingly, population in federal and state prisons has gone from roughly 93 per 100,000 over the last 35 years to 743, a figure that's 8 times per capita higher than any other advanced system. Something like Saudi Arabia, we are far worse than Russia. I won't go on. CO2 is also a 30-year trend, though there's been some minor fluctuation because of natural gas lately. But the pattern in area after area after area, and I've got pages full of it, there are exceptions, of course, suggests that we are facing a problem not easily resolved by politics as usual. Another way to say that is, a system problem tells you that the institutional base of the society and of the economy is driving something deeper than most of us have been willing to talk about. Now, what does that have to do with what we're going to do here today about the new economy movement? If we're facing a system problem, and that means if there is to be change, it would be a long, evolving, complex process over 10, 20, 30 years of work, what is the nature of the system? Most systems have been defined, and this gets you right to the heart of the question for the new economy movement. Most systems have been defined and are defined by where the power lies, almost always in connection with who owns the wealth. Critical point. So that in feudalism, those who had the land had the power and the wealth. In 19th century capitalism, small business capitalism, there was something of a free enterprise system, of much more decentralized, which led in part to the populist reactions as well. In the Soviet Union, the state owned the wealth. I'm oversimplifying all these, obviously, and the power was concentrated at that level. In our system, up until recently, corporations have dominated the system, and the wealth has been checked in part by a reasonably strong labor movement, never as strong as in Europe. That was at its peak, 34% of the labor force was organized. It was a complex system where the wealth was dominated by the corporate sector and kind of counterbalanced to a degree by labor. Labor has now declined from 34% of the labor force organized to about 11% in general and about 6% in the private sector, and decaying. So we are in a system where largely wealth holding and ownership is concentrated in corporate elites, in the corporations and in corporate elites. Now, there's a number you probably know about, but we're talking about the relationship between wealth and power in any system, including the new economy system we're going to talk about. The number that jolts me every time I look at it, the top 400 Americans, you could get them in this room, probably, easily I think, have more wealth, own more wealth than the bottom 180 million Americans taken together. Let that one sink in. That's a medieval concentration of the ownership of wealth. And I don't mean that rhetorically. I mean that the power relationships are medieval with that concentration of wealth. Now, the only check on that is I once gave that number in a lecture, and a medieval historian came up to me afterward, and he said, no, you're wrong. It was never that concentrated in medieval times. Probably true. So what you're seeing, and here's the question to ask yourself, and it opens the door to what I think is happening all over the country in an extremely interesting way, is if systems in part significantly revolve around how wealth is owned and controlled, and if you see a system like our own where the concentration of wealth is no longer countervailed, John Kenneth Galbraith's phrase, by a powerful labor movement, both economically and politically, and you don't particularly like the Soviet model of state ownership, what is it that might ultimately make sense to achieve equality, liberty, democracy, genuine democracy, ecological sustainability? How would you organize and develop such a system? I've just dropped a hot potato in your lap, I'm sure. And I want to open the conversation at that level because I think all of us sense that that may be a problem from the hands that were raised in this room, but we don't often speak about it in those terms. We talk about projects. I'm very much for the project development strategies. We talk about local strategies. We talk about the intersection of environmental movements and various forms of new economy undertaking institutionally. But we don't ask ourselves the question, and here is the question, might it be that what we are all beginning to do in the new economy movement, most hands I think came up on that subject, is laying groundwork potentially for the development of the base of a next transformative movement that moves us beyond the old systems that are producing those trends. Think about that one. Do you see yourself as doing a project? Or do you see yourself as laying groundwork for a transformation of the system? Is this the prehistory, possibly, of the next system? Is that what the new economy movement is about? I want to suggest to you that that is the potential in what most people call the new economy movement, and that self-awareness and discussion of it at that level allows us to begin to think about it in much more dynamic and interesting terms than many of us have been doing. So that's by way of preamble, just to drop a few hot potatoes in the room. Let me start at a different end of the problem. I had lunch today with a reporter who was covering the steel industry, and he reminded me of the Youngstown steel shutdown in 1977. How many folks remember it? Folks know about that. I was deeply involved in that with a number of people. Gerald Dickey was the guy who started a steel worker in Stoughton Lynn. And it was at that time in 1977, the biggest steel closing, at least publicly in modern history, and it received nationwide attention. Steel mills were not closing. 5,000 people were not losing their jobs in one day. It happens all the time now, so it's not news. But then it was big national news. And he reminded me that Gerald Dickey, a steel worker there, was one of the first, probably the first to suggest, the government's not going to do anything for us. The steel industry is not going to do anything for us. Either we begin to move in the direction that actually takes over in worker community ownership of this mill, or the city and the community will decline and decay. And indeed, at those days I was involved, there were people who went out to the garage and committed suicide at that city. And raising the question of, note carefully, transforming who gets to own the wealth in an institutional form, what was proposed was a worker community structure, is different from state socialism, corporate ownership. It begins to suggest certainly medieval structures, small business capitalism. It is a different way of thinking about transforming the institutional base of a political economic system. It opens up a democratization of wealth, not only economically, but in terms of political economy, a power base that might alter the structure of politics as well as the structure of economics. And that notion, very interesting notion, also had a spiritual and moral overtone. An ecumenical coalition led by a Catholic bishop and an Episcopal bishop involving all the religious leaders of the community were coming together saying, this community matters. This community matters, and unless we deal with the economic question from the perspective of what it does for a community, we are not speaking about what really counts. So the story about Youngstown, as many of you probably know, is that the steelworkers organized with the religious coalition. They built a huge political operation. They educated the country. They got the Catholic bishops and the Episcopal bishops to lead in the rest of the national religious community. They forced Governor Rhodes, a very conservative governor, to support them. They got the Carter administration to finance a highly professional study to show it could be done if you had $200 million in loan guarantees. They got the Carter administration to give them a pledge of $200 million in loan guarantees. And after the election of 1978, the money went away. They knew that might happen. And they understood their role was to raise the question and open up new directions, no matter what, that began to teach other people this problem and different solutions. So if you go to Ohio now, you'll find many, many, many worker-owned companies around the state of Ohio. And indeed, they understood their job was to try to educate people in that state over time to a different vision that didn't look like corporate capitalism, didn't look like state socialism, didn't look like small business capitalism, but had the community in mind as well as the workers and a different way of thinking about it. Now, if you go to Ohio today, you'll find lots of worker-owned companies, mostly organized as ESOPs, but some of them organized as worker co-ops. And the most interesting, if we skip 35 years, the most interesting of these, and you have the developments here in Pittsburgh that reflect this as well, are built in part on the Mondragon experience, and in part the people who learned from the Youngstown experience set up a Kent State University center to work on worker ownership. And you'll find in Cleveland, how many know about the Evergreen model in Cleveland? Several of you do. The Evergreen model in Cleveland, which is operating now, is a direct descendant over time of a process that is at least 30 years old. And the way it works is this. There are 3 worker-owned cooperatives or multi-stakeholder cooperatives in Cleveland, one of the poorest neighborhoods. They are linked together with a nonprofit corporation so that the goal is also to build the community, not simply the worker companies, and also so that they can't be sold off. They're part of the community structure. There's a revolving fund based on Mondragon experience, which allows contributions to build more worker-owned companies. And more important than that, and equally important, is that they are linked to a support system, very possible in this community, of the major hospitals and universities in the area that buy things. So for instance, in this particular neighborhood, 40,000, average income is around 21,000, very poor neighborhood, unemployment around 40%, I'm sorry, mostly black. In that neighborhood is Case Western Reserve University, the Cleveland Clinic, and University Hospital, big nonprofit, so-called anchor institutions. They purchase together, think about this, $3 billion in goods and services a year. None of which, that's in addition to the construction and in addition to salaries, just what they buy. None of which have been purchased in this city, in this community. So one of the strategies has been to turn some of that procurement, lots of taxpayer money in that procurement, money for health care, money for education, money for Medicare, Medicaid, et cetera, in those hospitals, to turn some of that procurement to support a whole structure that's oriented to worker community ownership and moving the institutional base in a very different direction. That's the so-called Evergreen model operating in Cleveland today. They are, by the way, not small institutions. Their largest urban greenhouse in the United States is one of these institutions. 3 million heads of lettuce a year is its production capacity. There's a large-scale laundry, not as large as the one that's being built here with Mondragon assistance and the steel workers behind it. And there is a very powerful solar installation company as well. That model is essentially a descendant over time. The people in who learned from Youngstown set up a center at Kent State University directly inspired by that worker effort. They were instrumental, as well as a number of groups, we were part of that, to help set this design underway that began to build a variation on the model that says, can we democratize the ownership of wealth institutionally in a way that is none of the above, is highly democratic, very American, very much anchored to community itself, and can we do it now? And the interesting answer is, it seems clearly possible that you can do this now, and indeed, things like that are happening all over the country, almost entirely, I would suggest to you, by virtue of the fact that the old system can't produce the results. If you go to Cleveland and many, many cities, and you do job training, there are no jobs. If you want to put money to invest in jobs, there is no money. If you bring in a corporation with tax benefits, tax incentives, it comes in and then leaves. And the decay continues. Cleveland's gone from about 900,000 to little under 400,000 in the last 30 years. The dead ends that are being reached on the ground are forcing people to ask deeper and deeper questions about what can be done if the old ways don't work. That's the same question being asked by the business school guys who had this big conference, by the Davos people, certainly by the left, by the Piketty argument. If we are actually beginning to face a systemic crisis that may go on for a long time, and you don't like any of the other alternatives, is there a democratic structure, are there democratic structures that might open the way to a new direction? Interesting, and again, I'm concentrating on Cleveland because it's a close-by example, but you have the same going on here with the laundry that's being set up with steelworkers' help and the Mondragon people. If that direction is possible, what you're seeing also is environmentalists and environmental attitudes are being put together with this mix. So the laundry that I just mentioned is probably one of the greenest laundries in the United States, uses about 1/3 of the water and 1/3 of the heat, and is integral. The values of the environmental movement are integral to it. So there is a melding in many cases, and we can talk about what's going on. Other things are going on all over the country. I'll mention several others as we go forward. But the point to notice is there's a melding in some parts of environmental concerns with the transformation of ownership concerns and the democratization of wealth patterns that we're beginning to see. That's particularly interesting and particularly important because there's been a conflict over time between labor on the one hand and the environmental movement. And what you're beginning to see is very serious environmentalists realizing that they want to achieve the goals of changing the long environmental trends. You can't get there from here just trying to regulate the corporations. We need to build both a new culture and a new institutional base over time. We are talking about historic change, not just projects and not just politics. So that's what's meant by systemic crisis. And in these particular movements, you're seeing awareness that the old ways don't work. Let me say something about that. You mentioned that I'd worked in both, I was legislative director in both the House and Senate. When I worked in the Senate, I was legislative director for a guy named Gaylord Nelson. Some of the old-timers will know that he's the founder of Earth Day, one of the greenest senators in the Senate at that time. In those days, you could pass legislation in which you could regulate corporate behavior, pass the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, and you could actually achieve something. There has been a radical decline in the capacity to do that. Look what happened with the attempt to deal with climate change in the last Congresses. The radical decline has occurred that the power base is no longer there. And many people in the environmental movement are beginning to realize there needs to be not only an attitudinal change, but rebuilding from the bottom up over time. And part of that is intersecting with the movement to democratize ownership in many different ways that's involved in what's called the new economy movement. So I'm throwing a hot potato into the room again. What I'm suggesting to you to consider is that we may actually be in a systemic crisis. That's very controversial, although most people sense something really profound is wrong. I'm suggesting that the old ways of owning and controlling wealth are no longer viable if you want to achieve values like equality, liberty, democracy, ecological sustainability, to say nothing of community. And that either there may be a new direction built up over time that is altering the system beyond what is the traditional socialist, traditional capitalist models to something new and very decentralized and democratic. Either there is such a direction that begins with institutional change and builds political and cultural change with it, or it may be that the decaying trends that I sketched at the beginning continue. Rome did decay. That is a logical possibility. What is exciting to me, and I spend a lot of time both on the road and we do research at the University of Maryland on this, what is exciting to me is that there's an explosion of understanding of the importance of new institutional development. And there's an explosion of things going on all over the country. So for instance, and let me give you what the most interesting thing from my perspective, because I was so heavily involved with the Youngstown fight, the steelworkers in 1977 fought tooth and nail, the International Union, against worker ownership. They didn't want to do anything with that, and they certainly didn't want these activist guys in Youngstown raising problems that might affect the leadership. There has been a radical reversal. The steel workers are now the leading force in American labor, promoting union worker co-ops around the country and advocating them around in this city and elsewhere, seeing that as a new direction. There are many other unions considering this. In Cincinnati, you're finding different unions working together to set up different forms of co-ops, and agricultural as well as other co-ops that are being set up, worker community co-ops of different structures. So we're beginning to see that turn. There are then older structures that are being rebuilt and redeveloped that also have this particular characteristic, changing who gets to own the wealth, but in a way that builds a decentralized model. The most obvious of these, obviously, is the traditional American co-op, or the co-op around the world. Credit unions are part of that, but if you include all the co-ops in the country, there are 140 million Americans involved in one way or another. A lot of that's in the credit union part, but credit unions themselves are potentially part of this structure as well. People don't think about credit unions. It's so obvious and so mundane. If you take all the credit unions together, they are one person, one vote banks. That's what a credit union is. They have $1 trillion in assets. That's as much as any of the big, almost any, except for one, of the big 5 New York banks. And they are a democratized institution of ownership. Most of them don't operate that way. But activists around the country are beginning to say they're run by bureaucracies that are, in many cases, very boring and tired. But activists around the country have just realized nobody goes to the annual meeting. If you go to the annual meeting, you can elect the board, and you could begin using this in several parts of the country as an instrument to boost other forms of new economy development. So that's just an example of traditional form of existing co-ops. There are, if you include the employee stock ownership plans, some of which are unionized experimentally, some of which are democratized, and many of which are open to radical change and to ecologically interesting developments. There are 10,000 people, 10,000 such companies with roughly 10 million people involved in one or another form of worker ownership. Most important in this field is it begins to raise the point that it's obvious you can do worker-owned companies, and if you don't like that particular form, you can do it in a different way. Another example, B Corps are popping up in many states. I think it's now 20 states that have allowed for the benefit corporation. How many people know what a B Corps is, yes? Benefit corporation, this is just exploding around the country. A private company which gets stock investments from somebody else, by law, must invest and produce its business plan in a way that benefits the stockholders. If not, they can be sued by the stockholder. Secondly, if you want to sell the company, you have to take the highest bidder, because that's benefiting the stockholders. That's what happened to Ben & Jerry's. They didn't want to sell to, who did they sell to? One of those terrible international companies. Yep, Unilever. But they had to accept the offer because that's the law. A benefit corporation is one in which going in, it is established that you can, in fact, put social and environmental criteria in ahead of profits, and that prevents any of the legal challenges. So if you invest in it, you know what you're doing. And that's popping up all over the country as well, a social benefit. Social enterprises are another form that you see around the country. People actually establishing a business solely to do social development, social economic change. That's another form. Traditional land trusts is still another example of what's going on in the new economy. How many know about land trusts? Okay, a land trust, you draw a circle around a piece of land, urban or rural. You put in a decentralized corporate form, usually a nonprofit corporation, can be a city corporation as well. And the goal is to prevent gentrification and to control and sometimes environmental development on the land and to prevent the kind of boosting of it by real estate investors. That's basically socializing the land. And I use that term because for 35 years ago, to do what I just said was regarded as extremely radical. There were one or two land trusts in the United States that anybody identified. There are now hundreds of them all over the country. In Irvine, California, they're doing 5,000 units of housing in land trust, which is a social ownership of the land to prevent gentrification, but also to control the development in a way that benefits many different groups and in many cases has an environmental component. There are even more interesting examples in the new economy movement that are not quite understood so far, but take you even beyond that. So let me tell you how land development, which is a big piece of this in many, many cities, is going on in several cities around the country without attention from the press. If the public puts in a big investment, this is just another example of an element of the new economy development process. If the public puts in a big investment in a mass transit system, subway or rail on the surface, at every major exit, there will be an explosion in land prices. Why is that? Because housing and commercial facilities make more money at the exits. And the developers rush in to grab it and boost up land prices and kick everybody else out. What's happening in many cities is, in fact, they set up a land trust, a different form of democratic ownership of the land around the exits, so that the public can capture the benefits of the public investment. Again, a structure that's, I live in Washington, D.C. That's happening in Washington, D.C. It's happening in Los Angeles as well. But the point to keep your eye on, it's changing the ownership of the capital and economic power base of the system in a way that democratizes its ownership, rather than allowing it either for the private developers or in some state-owned structure. That's the characteristic we're seeing in all of these developments around the country. Some form of experimentation and development that has a different principle at the heart of it, building from the bottom, but also changing ownership. There are others. Obviously, we're going to hear about the public banking kind of movement around the country. That, too, is a piece of this puzzle. The state of North Dakota, as many of you know, has had a publicly owned state bank for something like 90 years. It is a financing system that can be used to support the kind of things we're talking about here, and 20 states have had legislation introduced to have public banks of one kind or another. And the proposals go beyond that to regional and national public banking for the longer term. So I can give you more and more of these examples, and they are exploding around the country, but let me give you a website and then we'll say some more about it. The website that we manage is called community-wealth.org. Put the dash in because there's one without the dash that's a different website. It's called Community Wealth. And what we do there is simply survey other places around the country where things of the kind I'm talking about in the new economy movement are happening, and websites that, for instance, in terms of worker ownership, go very deep into the worker ownership, into land trusts, into public ownership. Public banks are people who know a great deal about each of these different segments, far more than we know as well. There are also several states, and again, this has not been picked up yet, something like 27 states in the United States have major investment shares in business, so it's publicly involved ownership and control of some business development, an element that hasn't been much publicized, but also emerging. City municipalities, what happened in Boulder, California, taking over the municipal utility in order to achieve a green solution rather than coal-fired solution. That's happening in many parts of the country. And what we're witnessing, and we can go on and on and on, and the book I've written on this called What Then Must We Do kind of surveys this, but many people are realizing this. Something is brewing at the local level and at the state level, the primary characteristics of which are changing ownership of wealth in a democratic structural way that's different from the old model, try to tax the money, let the corporations have it and try to tax it back, and not state-dominated, centralized, and attempting to anchor and build community. Let me say that again. Something's happening around the country that is characterized by democratic ownership of one kind or another in many, 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 many areas. That's the new economy movement, much of which shares an ecological vision, most of which is also oriented to building the community, think about Youngstown, and most of which also begins to generate more and more sophisticated models, some of which are also being picked up by the most interesting labor unions in the country so that there may be a power base. Now, I'm a realist. This all may go nowhere. That is a logical possibility, interesting marginal development in American history. On the other hand, there are signs, if the crisis and long trends I've suggested to you are any indication, problems that cannot be solved by the economic system and the political system will continue to fester and develop, demanding some kind of an answer. And the possibility I think we're witnessing I am speaking to the person in your seat. The possibility we're beginning to witness is that maybe we happen to live at a particular juncture in American history in which the foundations of something that might become a new system beyond corporate capitalism, beyond state socialism, may well be being established now slowly over time. Maybe. What you're seeing, I think, is not simply what I would call projectism. My project is interesting, how's yours? No, I think you're seeing a response to dead ends that cannot be solved any other way, that are forcing people to experiment with new directions that actually go to the basis of political and economic power in the system. Who owns the wealth? And what is exciting about it is that the answer is being given experimentally in a radically decentralized, very powerful American way. Let me say a word about that. I tease my friends from Europe, in the European countries, particularly the Germans and the French, who have much better social programs, much better social security programs, much better benefits, much better health care systems. Social democracy is more advanced in those countries. And I suggest to them that the United States may produce the next great transformation much faster than you will. And they laugh at me. And I say the reason is we are not actually protected by the social democratic systems in the way that you are. In fact, the capacity to support that is declining, and so the forcing conditions of the next transformation are developing much faster here in America than in most other countries by virtue of the pain levels increasing at the local level. I think that's actually true. And the other reason things are interesting in the United States is there is a sort of can-do, we can do it here kind of attitude that is very, very down-home American. I'm from Racine, Wisconsin. It's the kind of things people do locally that is an American attitude. Now, I am a historian and a political economist. I am not a fortune teller or a soothsayer. And I'm also a realist. I've been involved in, as was mentioned, in hard-nosed Washington politics in an earlier phase of my career. So I'm not interested in utopian theories or abstractions that go nowhere. I think there is a realistic, almost certain possibility that the traditional model that we all took for granted under American liberalism, I come out of Wisconsin liberalism, there is a very small possibility that that will regain power, that will, Arthur Schlesinger Jr. used to say the pendulum always swings in 30-year swings. What he forgot to notice is that that form of political economy, large corporations balanced by labor unions both politically and economically, social democrats, liberalism in America, that form depended upon strong labor. Unfortunately, labor has gone, as I said, way down, and the basis institutionally of that model is really decayed. On the other hand, the system doesn't collapse in the traditional left or Marxist view. Government is 3 times the share of the GDP that it once was. It was 11% of the GDP in 1929. It's now 32, 33%. It basically doesn't collapse, but it doesn't reform. It decays and stagnates. Stagnation is the new term of art these days, a system that doesn't, it decays and stagnates. That is the ground in which, people don't think about this, that's the ground in which you can, in fact, develop a democratic, experimental, local development. If there's an explosion, it'll go to the left or right in a way you won't like. If there's time to develop experience and knowledge of the kind I'm talking about, you actually have the opportunity, maybe, of establishing the knowledge and the projects and the experience and the people and the organizers and the people with their own experience locally that develops the basis of alternative institutions that move us in a new direction. The new economy movement is about that, in my view. Some parts of it are self-conscious about that, thinking that indeed, in the prehistory of the New Deal, all of the developments that mattered were developed in the state and local laboratories of democracy and only later became transformed to principles at the national level. Some people are thinking that way. in the way that I'm suggesting is a possibility. Others are just trying to solve problems locally, which is also useful. And many others are inspired, particularly from the environmental movement, to trying to open up a whole new direction that may at least solve a problem that they've identified. That complex, uneven, experimental, difficult movement is, I think, what the new economy movement is all about. But what's important to note about it is that it actually is happening. The press does not cover this. It cannot cover it. Most local newspapers do not have reporters that they are willing to, that can pay to cover local development of this kind. And they certainly, most of them are conservatively owned, aren't interested. But in fact, if you dig into the various internet sources, or if you go to the website I'm talking about, or if you talk to people around the country who care about this, you'll find that there is in fact an underground explosion of development of this particular kind. And if the analysis I've suggested to you is even close to correct, the ongoing conditions of political stalemate, stagnation, environmental difficulty, climate change, and the moral pain that develops from these failing trends of growing inequality, ecological change, climate change, presenting a moral challenge as well as a political, economic challenge to people who care about these things, forcing people to ask, is there a way at all that we can begin to act in a new direction? What is interesting about the new economy movement is responding in different ways in different parts of the country, saying yes to that particular direction. And indeed, even in some business schools, in several business schools, experiments are being, courses are being taught about social enterprise, even a few on worker cooperatives, and beginning to raise questions about the future of capitalism that are opening the doors in the most sophisticated way, even in business schools around the country. So my suggestion to you is, and I've begun to learn a little bit about what's going on here in Pittsburgh, and particularly about the laundry that's been supported in a Mondragon fashion by the steelworkers. I suggest to you that this particular city, from what I've learned about the politics and about the people here, has a potential of really opening a big, big direction of this kind. That is to say, with a new progressive mayor, with some strong labor base, with people who are dedicated from the Merton Center and around the new economy movement and the environmental movement, there is a way of thinking about a city like Pittsburgh particularly that begins to say, what if we looked at the next 20 years? What could we draw upon from all the experimentation that's going on around the country of the kind I've just sketched? How might we use city power? The mayor in the city of Cleveland was very important to that development. How might we use political power? How might we actually create self-consciously an integrated long-term direction? By the way, all of the developments I'm talking about, all these worker-owned co-ops particularly, are businesses. The American business community has been very successful in organizing legislation and technical and tax and other assistance for business development. Almost all of it's available for this kind of direction as well. So that if you raise your sights to the big question of, might this new mayor, might this be nudged, might be helped, might he be given a direction that would actually think of the city and the big anchor institutions here, some of which might play, some of which might have to be convinced to play. I understand there's a difference amongst the anchor institutions and the hospitals and universities here, just as in every community. Might this city, over the next 10 to 20 years, actually begin to open a profound leading direction in this movement? My sense of it, from the little I've learned about the community here and about the possibilities, is this could be an extraordinary opportunity, and that the next system in its communities might find a home here in this one as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We're now going to hear from our panelists, Mike Krauss, who is the founder of the Pennsylvania Public Banking Project, Dr. Audrey Murrell, who is former director of the Berg Center and now associate dean for the College of Business Administration, and Ralph Bangs, associate director of the Center for
Race and social progress.
Race and social progress. So we'll start with Dr. Bangs. Thank you.
Thank you. So let me say first, Gar, that I think that your most recent book, What Then Must We Do, is brilliant. I've read it twice, and I take away from it 3 main points that I agree with. And one is that the U.S. certainly has extremely serious problems, and many of these problems are getting worse, whether they are high health care costs and growing costs, or mass incarceration, or not dealing with global warming. Many, many examples that you mentioned. One maybe that you didn't mention in the book is the high cost of college and the growing student debt. That certainly is one of the many big problems. Second point, one of your big points that I agree with is that the current political and economic system can't fix these problems. The economic power is too concentrated among the corporate leaders and the rich, and our efforts at social movements and other types of political activity that you agree that we should continue to pursue are not really sufficient against this massive power that is increasingly taking over the control of the political and economic system. Third major point is that you list many examples, and you've mentioned some of those today, many examples of community level or social actions to create more democratic businesses, and many examples of government taking on providing more services and goods in a more efficient way and socially responsible way that benefits a whole community rather than a few. Let me ask you 2 questions, though. One is that you don't say in your book how a community should organize itself so that we could work on the many squares of the checkerboard. That's your image in the book. The checkerboard, each square is about a different type of strategy or action for democratizing and having more social programs. You don't really talk about how a community like ourselves could organize itself to work on many of these possible strategies at one time. And should we create a community-wide coordinating committee? Should we have subcommittees for each type of strategy, or by neighborhood, or what are your suggestions there for having a more comprehensive approach, which is what you recommend in this book? The second and final question that I have for you is that you mentioned 3 types of capitalism in your book, which make a lot of sense in terms of organizing these categories. America is in the pure corporate capitalist form, and much of your book deals with that. So what I want to ask you is, have you found any reception to your ideas in Europe, which has the managed corporate capitalism that you mentioned, the second type? And have you thought about or approached anyone in the communist countries with that are rapidly privatizing their economies and creating a more individualistic private business, less social welfare type of a system in China, Vietnam, Cuba, for example? So I just want you to comment on those 2 other types of capitalism that you mentioned in your book and how your ideas maybe are being received. I'm not sure that they have questions. Yeah.
Okay. I'll be very brief because other people have. All right. She's too much democracy. Is there a way should there be a comprehensive organization? How would you do it in one community in a comprehensive way? I don't have a simple answer to that. I think that really depends on local conditions. I think at some point that is almost certainly going to happen in many communities, that the people from different parts of this exploding kind of movement begin to see themselves together and begin thinking about larger structures of participatory democracy, public budgeting and so forth, participatory budgeting. I don't know the conditions well enough here. It may be that you're at that stage. At some cities that may happen very quickly. Others I don't know. So I think that's a matter of historical evolution at the right time and place. There is a strong interest in this in Europe, in different parts of Europe. I myself I've become an anti-traveler. I'm really become an American first right now. There's too much going on here right now, so we get a lot of invitations to speak abroad, and I've been rejecting most of them. But there is a very explosive development of concern and interest, because we get a lot of foreign visitors coming through, want to know more about it. And I'm certainly not the only person involved in the new economy movement, but if I can tell you anything about it from my experience, the Swedes are coming through. I've just been asked I'm going up to Montreal to do an international conference, keynoting on this stuff. There is real interest exploding around the country. There is also interest, particularly in Cuba right now, for this kind of thing. And again, I have not been traveling or going around the country, around to Cuba or any of the other countries, but some of them are experimenting with this. And indeed, our research director was there was a meeting of some Chinese experts were coming through. What can they learn from the American experience? I have no idea how far that's going to go, but there is some interest that we're aware of.
Well, I'm actually not part of the new economy. I'm actually part of that group of business faculty that were gathered in the Magic Kingdom that you started off your comments with, who was there along with my colleagues wrestling over issues related to business and social responsibility, social impact, enterprise, and the like. I'm also not part of the group of the new economy. I'm actually a fan of not just the old economy, but the old focus on social justice. And so I actually take a different look at this. I agree that we're in a serious crisis situation, but I tend to look at this problem slightly differently, not necessarily a failure of structures, but a failure of leadership. And so I don't think that this is necessarily an issue of systems or structure, but an issue of people. And a time for us to go back and rethink a couple of fundamental things about the people who we put in charge of our institutions, the people who we trust, the people who are in leadership roles, or the people who are in leadership roles that we ignore and don't hold accountable for what happens. I think we need to rethink the purpose of leadership, that leaders aren't there to serve their own purpose, they're there to serve the purpose of the people who put them there. I think too often we sit back in gatherings just like this and we talk about issues, we talk about problems, but the very people who we go in ballot booths to elect to represent us, we don't hold them accountable. And then we wonder why things aren't going the way they should, why decisions are made that don't reflect our interests, is because we don't hold the people accountable. We talk about corporations, but then I would charge you to sit down with your checkbook at the end of today, or maybe while you're doing your taxes, and see where you spend your money. Is your money going for the things that you say that you support? And if not, maybe that has something to do with the fact that business is being responsible to you as one of its stakeholders. And that what are we doing to hold accountable those people that we put our trust in? I think that we need to go back to how we used to think about issues of privilege. And that privilege is not something that we seek. Privilege is really something that has responsibility associated with it. We happen to be sitting in a region where privilege carried responsibility, where those that have a moral obligation to pay attention to the least of these. We no longer look at privilege in that way. We look at privilege as a good to be acquired and held on to. That's a leadership issue. It's not a system issue. And we have a fundamental problem in terms of understanding issues of rights, that individual rights are now all of a sudden more important than community rights, that individual rights should take precedent over everything else, no matter how obscene those individual rights are. That's a leadership issue. I want to return to leadership as stewardship, that leaders are fundamentally stewards who are holding the resources in trust for the people that they represent. That's what we spend our time doing here. I can't speak about any other business school except this one. And at this business school, we have a 3-year certificate in leadership and ethics for our undergraduate business students. We are the only school in the country that approaches ethical leadership in this way. We have for a decade, and I'll tell you what those students are doing. They're out there building those social enterprises. They're out there working with organizations like the center. They're building new structures and new models, and they are learning how to be different leaders in whatever organization that happens to be fortunate enough to hire them. I really don't think that the issue is just as a matter of dismantling the structure, we have to really rethink the people that we're putting in charge and the tools that they are using to be able to drive those organizations sometimes into the ground. Audrey Lorde said it best, for the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. Thanks.
And we'll never build a new economy with the old banking system. So let's be clear about what's going on. Audrey did my heart good. I'm a card-carrying Episcopalian. I was an acolyte, a lay reader, a vestryman, and stewardship. Stewardship really matters to me. That's how I approach things. We're stewards of what we've been given. The problem, though, is it's not just a matter of wanting to be a good steward, because as Gar pointed out, with the statistics, it's working against us. There has been such a concentration of wealth in this country, and if you know anything all about government, I'm a government major, power flows from wealth. When wealth is concentrated, so too is power. The wealth is now so concentrated that it's very, very difficult to get things done, to make leaders respond, because they really can't. In fact, they are responding. They're responding to the concentration. So what can we do to break that concentration? That's where I'm coming from, and that's where I think public banking is coming from. We need to re-democratize wealth. That's our job. How do you do that? Believe me, a frontal assault on Washington is out of the question. They're simply too well dug in. Some of the older hands here may realize how the civil rights movement actually got started. It got started with Dwight Eisenhower. The Democrats would not pass a civil rights bill. So Eisenhower, as Attorney General, picked off the federal judges one by one and got rid of the segregationists. Because Eisenhower, a general, wasn't going to try a frontal assault on the Dixiecrats in Congress. It was suicidal. Been there, done that. He did D-Day, you know. He knew what that was about. As a general, he didn't fight battles he couldn't win. I'm not in the battles we can't win. A frontal assault on Washington is a waste of time, money, and effort. What then can we do? Focus locally. Public banks can be created locally at your county, city, or state level. And in so doing, you can harness public assets and leverage them for the public good where you live. That is locally generated credit, affordable, sustainable, for locally directed economic development. I'm a government major. Mao Zedong, let 1,000 flowers bloom. I'd like to see 1,000 public banks. It would transform America. 3 in this state would be enough. Philly, Pittsburgh, someplace else, that would be quite enough to get the ball rolling in this Commonwealth and in this country. So we can take our own assets, the public assets which we own. You know, this city is not broke. Philadelphia, shutting schools is not broke. If you forget about the budget and read the consolidated annual financial report of your city, you discover you've got money squirreled away all over the place. Broke Philadelphia sits on $12.2 billion of investments in Scandinavian hedge funds. I mean, that's where the money is, getting, in many cases, lousy returns. A fraction of that, capitalizing a public bank, would drive, 1, better returns than their Scandinavian hedge fund, 2, non-tax revenue from the bank's profits to the city's budget every year, and 3, all sorts of economic development. All of it locally directed and locally controlled. Now, I was going to say I am a Republican, but most folks wouldn't say that anymore. I'm what was a Republican. You know, long time ago, I worked for Dick Thornburg, and that was like, you know, light years away. Things have changed. However, I understand that locally directed economic development, locally controlled for local purposes, really works for America. A long time ago, de Tocqueville observed this country and noted that its diversity was extraordinary. It is still extraordinary. The diversity of this country is still possibly our greatest resource. If that can be enabled, who knows what's possible? It won't be the same in Pittsburgh or Philly or Wilkes-Barre or Scranton or Sacramento or Richmond, California or any place else. It may be hugely different from place to place. That's just great. That's just great. You folks take control of your money, capitalize your own bank, and decide what you want to do with it. And things will get done. Thank you.
Great. I think we'd love to open it up for some audience questions, if that's all right with our panelists. So if you have questions, raise your hand to the level of urgency of your question, and we'll take it from there. Yeah.
Thank you, Mark. Gar, I'm I'm involved in a Pennsylvania statewide organization that is pushing for single-payer health care for the state. And I'm curious what you've seen in terms of new economy developments regarding health care.
Well, let me very briefly, as you know, that Vermont is probably going to go to single payer this year or next year. The first state using the Obamacare and then transcending to single payer. Single payer was passed twice by the legislature in California, and Schwarzenegger rejected it twice. My own view over time, and the 20 states have had, roughly 21 states have had legislation introduced to produce single payer outcomes. My own view on this, and it's a long discussion, that as the Obamacare on the one hand and health care costs on the other, and the inefficiencies of some of that go forward. I'm a supporter of Obamacare, better than nothing. But as that goes forward, I think we're going to see the problems and the costs building up, and that the only answer available will be single payer. And I suspect it'll be state by state by state. Over time, long process.
Thank you, and thank you all, by the way, for coming here tonight. This has been very interesting this afternoon. My question is everything that you've mentioned, everything in terms of the new economy, I think it's under the radar of a lot of the corporations. And I don't think, I would say it's very easy for them to ignore us or ignore the new economy right now. Should the new economy and the locally community organizations to get larger and start to actually impact their revenues, then I think it could be a whole different situation. And just as a quick little example, and then I'd like your thoughts on it, and that is, let's just say, for example, even right now, let's say Monsanto went to the Cleveland Hospital and said, look, we really know that GMO products are fine for people, and we will give you $20 million a year for the next 5 years to run a study for us, and we will provide all the greenhouse stuff for you, all the GMO greenhouse stuff for you. That's going to be kind of hard for the Cleveland Hospital to say no to. And if it's not $20 million a year, maybe it's some different amount. But I just think that if corporations, if we get above a particular level, that corporations are going to step in and affect it. And I'd just like your thoughts on it. Thank you.
That's probably for the panel, but yeah. Well, let me put it. We will see. That is to say, that is not what the implication is. And I know this in what you mean. It's dead end. Don't do it, because it's going to be killed anyway. And indeed, that's a possibility. I think it's an outside possibility. On the other hand, there is so much pain developing that you may see that there are more and more constituencies building. I'm from Wisconsin. I lived during the McCarthy era. In Wisconsin, it was worse than any place in the country. Nothing could be moving politically. McCarthy shot everything that moved politically. And anyone who looked at the world said, well, obviously you can't change anything. This is the way it is. And then the 60s exploded. It is not clear that what you say is inevitable. Certainly there are going to be groups that don't want this direction. On the other hand, some of them are quite happy to work with you rather than against you and see positive gains in it. But most important, it seems to me that if the implication of what you're saying is don't start because you're going to get stopped later, I would reject that. I think it's very important to see how far this development goes. And as I've said earlier, I think the emerging context is forcing more and more people to make those kinds of choices and think seriously about those choices.
I'd add to that. If you work locally in lots of venues, lots of communities, lots of states, lots of cities, lots of counties, then you build up collectively a huge amount of political capital. And you can begin to direct that political capital. And each locality can reinforce the other locality. I want to kind of say this again. Do not look to Washington. And don't look to Harrisburg. Look to yourselves. And join with those other communities that are looking to themselves and link them together. Then you create a new polity. You create something new in American government. It is quite possible.
Gar, you've written and spoken elsewhere, and I didn't hear you talk this today, about regionalizing wealth and the levels of wealth ownership. And particularly, I've heard you contemplate and deliberate over where some of those issues might come in that we just have no idea where they might be. For instance, communities perhaps in the future own wealth, but one community sits on an oil well and another one sits on an agricultural farm. There's going to be a complete disparity of wealth there. Then we have to shift wealth and ownership somehow to the next level up. So something of what this regionalism is, it greatly affects the environmental concerns, but also the liquidity of currency. And possibly getting back to a question that Mr. Banks had about that, as you're a historian of revolutions of sorts, what patterns might we learn from past revolutions to say what levels or what part of the region would be important for perhaps a region like Pittsburgh to focus on now as a way to lay that foundation for the future? If we are ones to build a foundation, clearly, as Mr. Krauss just said, we need to look to ourselves, start small, but there might be some strategic levels at which make sense from history to focus on very early. And I hate to do this, but second question for Ms. Murrell. If there's any work that you guys are doing to decentralize leadership within organizations.
So I'm going to give a very brief answer to. Well, don't trust me if I say that. Sometimes I go on. There are a couple of questions involved. One has to do with the continental scale of the system. That most people, there is a beginning awareness in many fields of political economy, and there have been a number of studies done by this, by a couple of Harvard professors. We don't quite realize the scale of our system compared with other systems. So one way to ask it is, can you have participatory democracy in a continent-wide system of 330 million people? Pretty hard. Another way to ask it is, the democratic systems in Europe are tiny countries compared with us. You can drop Germany into Montana, literally. So the scale of the continent makes it, in Madison, this was the Madisonian system. Spread them out and it's easier to divide and conquer. That's exactly what Madison says in number 10. So ultimately, as population grows, the question of whether regional development is part of this, is part of the answer to your question. That's a long discussion, but there's emerging conversation about regionalism as a long-term answer. I don't have an answer about what parts of what ought to be done in Cleveland. I think if I were to answer it, I think there are concrete things going on here that need to be developed of their own, and they're very exciting things to do. There's also time for study groups to begin to confront and read about and think about these larger questions. And I sometimes say, and let me say it now, I'm a great admirer of the 1960s women's movement. And the reason is Chairman Mao said power grows out of the barrel of a gun. And the women's movement said, no, 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 no. What you do is you get a half a dozen friends together, you get some coffee and some pizza, you study, figure out your ideas, clarify it together in a small group, and then you figure out what can we do concretely here, and then you support each other. That's where power comes from. And I think they were right, and that's the way I would proceed to not answer your question, but to think about it and begin to develop strategies that are appropriate to the locality.
Audrey, do you want to take that other question?
I think he answered it. Okay. Yeah, I actually think he answered it.
Okay. Okay.
Hi. I have a question for you, Audrey, actually. I like what you said about leadership. I was wondering if you felt that we could have leadership and stewardship that represents the welfare of the people in this current capitalist system.
Actually, I think we do. I think we already have. I think the problem is that we tend to focus much more attention, both in the public domain and as individuals, on those who get it wrong as opposed to those who get it right. And so I think that there's tons of examples that are out there, but I do think that there's an issue of accountability. And so sometimes accountability also means that we hold leaders accountable even when we benefit from what they're doing. And I think that that's part of the issue that we have to face. I also think that social change happens not just because we change systems, it's because people demand that they change, that people and the collective will of the people are the ones that, and I think you can see this not just from the women's movement, but from a lot in the social justice and the social rights movement. There were people that came together, people actually of faith who came together, who made that happen. So if you go back and study that history, you'll see, and that they held those leaders accountable. They were the fuel behind the leaders. And I'm very concerned that part of why we have a leadership crisis is that we put the wrong people in place and then we go about our business and expect them to do things on our behalf without us as active participants in the process, that we have become passive and complacent. And as a result, we wake up all of a sudden in a state of crisis. And that's what concerns me.
My name is Essence House, and I'm a student at the Community College of Allegheny County for Business Management, and I'm a sophomore. I have a question for you, Gar. I wanted to know, what is your stand and your view on international students coming into this country and putting in a lot of work in innovations and inventions and just the whole immigration laws? And in addition to that question, because of your background with many different countries, I wanted to know how do you feel international fair trade and or arbitration can build the economy in an innovative way?
That's a small question. That's not a small question.
Yeah, that's where do I stand on the issue of immigration and immigration reform? I'm obviously for the people here who should be allowed to stay here and become citizens. I'm not sure that's exactly what your first question was, but I'm strongly for that direction. I'm very much for the fair trade movement, which is in fact one way to support the new economy movement in other countries, that is buying from cooperatives that are particularly of this structure and direction. So I'm not sure that that's exactly what you were asking, but that would be my two answers.
Thank you. And also one more question for Miss Audrey. I'm interested into the business school that you were talking about. I feel that there is a lack of business ethics all around, and that some say what is ethical is not ethical to other standards compared to other countries internationally and just cultural practices. Can I find out more information about the school?
You absolutely can, and as a student of the community college, there is an articulation agreement between our school that if you maintain a certain grade point average across a set of curriculum, you get an automatic admittance into the College of Business Administration. So email me and we'll talk about it.
All right, thank you so
All right.
much.
Great. So many questions. I'm going to apologize in advance to not getting to everybody, but thank you.
We're making you work for it, Mark.
Hi, my name is Harvey Holtz, and I'm a member of the New Economy Work Group. I'm also a card-carrying member of Socialist. I'm a socialist, and my card is red, as you might know. Now, when Marcia here asked you the question about what would happen when capital becomes aware of what's happening and they feel that they're intruded upon, you had suggested, well, let's worry about that when it happens. I think something like that. My suggestion, I've read both of your books and a lot of your material and Richard Wolff and all these things. I've also read critiques of the new economy. And I think that we have to be aware of the challenges to a new economy. Not just say, well, we're not going ahead, that we won't go ahead if we know that they're there. We must go ahead, but we must be aware of the challenges. And just some challenges, the fact that we're talking about a sixth extinction, and that could happen within 15 years, we could, using the reserves that we have, will go above the 2-degree mark that the planet will be in crisis. Can we have enough new economy environmental things to replace fossil fuel, or do we have to battle with fossil fuel at the same time? Also, the coercive law of competition. What about firms competing against each other, co-ops against each other, co-ops against B corporations, leading to self-exploitation, business failures, externalizations, absorptions, and inequality? We have to be, well, I'm saying, I have much more here, and I'd like to talk to you about that later. But what I'm saying is we must be aware of the challenges, and we must be aware of where we need to battle capital, where they might destroy us.
I'm also, I think it adds a time limit, perhaps, to the response of the new economy.
Yes. Let me give you a website if you're interested in this level of question. The website is Pluralist Commonwealth. which is a long discussion of theoretical problems of this kind. The pluralist commonwealth is a term I use to describe a system which begins with local communities, but may build up capacities at higher order structures to support and nurture healthy communities in the new economy direction, plural forms of ownership, public banking, worker co-ops, et cetera. But that particular website attempts to address some of your questions.
All right, we have time. We actually have time for one more question. I'm sorry, and there's so many. Who really wants it?
This is not your last opportunity to see Dr. Alperovitz, excuse me. We're going to be at CMU this evening from 7 until about 8:30 at Baker Hall, so I'm going to encourage you all to come back. And then tomorrow morning, he'll be giving a presentation from New Economy to Pluralist to Commonwealth. So please come back at Baker Hall in the Giant Eagle Wing. So, yeah, Giant Eagle Wing, I know, what can I say? Yes, yes. Yes, we are going to have a reception immediately following as well until about 4:30. So, all right, one last question.
Yeah, this is more a quick comment, but you might have responses. I think about the movements on the international plane, like the social forum, groups, indigenous groups that have had to almost like fight to create their own economic and social forums, and we now have governments in Latin America that we wouldn't have ever believed were possible back in the 70s or 80s. So I think as we study and look around, we need to look at those international models, and particularly people of color in this country as well, who are basically left out of our economy and still are, and have had to form forms of alternative economy without calling it any of those things. So I think we need to look at our language and keep including all those rich examples of people that have, cooked for each other or created alternative, emergency groups and all this stuff. I just think so we're not leaving that out of the whole picture.
Thank you. We've gotten an extension to run, but if you want to comment on that. Anyone? No? Okay, we got one last question, and then we're really done.
I just want to make this a model for a quick question. Given that we're one of the largest corporate cities in the country, should we be focusing on places like Clairton, Duquesne, McKeesport, Homestead, Aliquippa, more even than the city of Pittsburgh, where a frontal assault is almost like Washington?
Pretty sure that's for you.
That's for me. Look, I think people locally will know the answer to that if you investigate it. In some cases, there are some of the businesses there are leading businesses that are very positive. There are green businesses that are very responsible. They are small in percentages, but nonetheless, they are allies in this fight. There are others that are too powerful to take on this week. You need to be stronger next week. That's another set of questions. I do want to comment about what Audrey said as well, because and I want to urge it in the following way. The discussion that she and I implicitly had, we didn't get very far, we've only just met each other, is one that I think is critical for people to engage in. That is to say, is it the case that there is a leadership problem which good and active citizens involved with can alter the trends that I began to describe by virtue of that without changing the system, the institutions? That was the critical. Or is institutional change required, also involving critical activities of citizens to get there and political activity? So that set of questions, I think, is on the table. And Audrey and I may disagree about it, but it's a really important question to open up and ask and debate in study groups like the women's study groups, et cetera. I think that, in my own judgment, obviously you've heard it, but I also think that there were trends going on, particularly with Dr. Martin Luther King at the end of his life, and I've done an article about this in Sojourners recently, where he clearly was struggling with precisely this question, and that it was very important to develop leadership, very important to make institutions accountable, and if that didn't work, the next question was institutional change. I may or may not be right about that, but there's increasing evidence that that is precisely the question he was trying to struggle with himself, and I think we all need to not accept my position or Audrey's position, but to actually put that on the table in the next women's movement you have, young men.
I'd like to add a comment to that. I don't think you're going to re-educate Paul Ryan or most members of Congress. Like rats in a Skinner box, they've discovered, they hit the bar, the pellet comes down, and they take the reward. However, across this country are the 20-somethings, the 30-somethings, the 40-somethings who will govern this country in 20 years. They're somewhere close to home. They're not in Washington. They're in Beaver County or Washington County or Pittsburgh or Westmoreland or Buckle, wherever the hell they are. They're close to home. And they will grow into more responsibility over time. That's what's going to happen with them, the younger crowd of politicians and public servants. You need to identify in your community those younger members of your community who are going to hold power in 20 years and educate them now to a different kind of bar press response. You know, teach them you press the bar, you get approbation from grateful, concerned, caring, decent citizens. Teach them that response. Forget the Congress, forget those guys, forget your senators. They're absolutely a waste of time. Focus locally, find the leaders of tomorrow in your community and teach them the right thing to do.
Thank you so much. Thank you to the panelists, and I do want to say we have programs in the back of the room for the activity happening this evening, and for those the workshops and panels and great activities that we have for tomorrow. So please see Dan or JT. Anyway, thank you very, very much.